Good afternoon, everyone. This is Betsy Hill, President and Chief Operating Officer of Learning Enhancement, and I am very pleased to welcome you to today's Neuroscience and Education webinar. Today we have a very special guest, and Dr. Lori Desautels. Lori is a professor at Marian University in Indianapolis. She serves as a university supervisor and instructor for both the Indianapolis Teaching Fellows and the Teach for America program. I've met a number of her students, and it's pretty exciting to work around them. I've forgotten how enthusiastic and energetic and capable our young teachers are. She has also a lot of experience with emotionally handicapped students. She served as a school counselor and as a private practice counselor, and she is very, very passionate about engaging her students who are teachers and teachers-to-be through helping them understand how neuroscience really contributes to education. So I'd like to welcome Lori to our webinar this afternoon.
Betsy, thank you so much. I am absolutely thrilled, and I'm looking so forward to the next 45 minutes, hour time together. Just very important information to talk about today.
Wonderful. So we'll just go ahead and jump right in. And
okay.
The cover at your book, which is How May I Serve You, has a fascinating cover which shows the face of a girl, and there are all kinds of words written on her face like worthless, loser, misfit, failure. Why did you choose this image, and what does it represent to you?
Betsy, it represents a lot of aspects of adolescence and also just, where we are right now and, in this time. And I think adolescence, it's always been a challenging time to be between the ages of 11 and 12 and 17 and 18. I think it's an exciting time, but I think in particular right now, we really live in this time of fast-paced technology and the most populous and diverse time in our world's history. So when I looked at this cover and I've worked with so many adolescents, I think that it's a very vulnerable and fragile time. And, in education, and I'm coming from that perspective today, we are very concerned about our math and language and science scores, and well, we should be. But I think there's an inner world, and that inner world is the life of these adolescents that are experiencing unprecedented amounts of stress. And to be an adolescent today and to be in the schools with peers, which we'll talk about in these 45 minutes, this inner world sits inside and directly affects formal instruction. So I think these are the words that so many children and adolescents are placing inward at this time. And again, the beauty is it's not permanent, but we have to take a look at self-esteem, and we have to look at these social and emotional skills.
Great. So in your book, you're talking about the kind of perilous situation almost, certainly risky situation that so many of our children are finding themselves in. And one of the things that I just love about your book is that it deals with it both from the sort of societal broad perspective and really makes a point about how pervasive the issue is, and then you tell the intimate details of stories that really reflect those statistics in a very human way. So let's start with the big picture, though, and perhaps you could talk about some of the statistics that really show, really amplify a little bit what your initial comments and show us what we're facing.
Yes, and those statistics, they look grim, but I want to start out by, as we look at this PowerPoint, and I actually am waiting for my PowerPoint to come up right now. We had some technical difficulties, but as we look at these statistics, 20% of our children and adolescents between the ages of 8 and 17, as I mentioned earlier, are experiencing this chronic stress. And we also, as I mentioned, we are in a very diverse time. So in a general ed classroom today, 1 of 5, 1 of 8, depending on the environment and the school setting, of children are learning in very diverse ways. They are experiencing many emotional and academic challenges. So, when we look at stress, when we look at social and emotional development, which for me and for many of us we see as kind of the umbrella that supports academic success. So when we look at this, we have to look at the good news, and that good news is that because of this educational neuroscience piece, we know now as educators that experiences and thoughts structurally and functionally change the brain. So as we look at these statistics, the fabulous news is that as teachers, and I want to include parents and school leaders, we can create and provide experiences for our students, which I want to talk about today, that that really rewire those neural pathways so that we're tapping in to that diverse way of learning, to their talents, to their interests, to their passions. So it's a difficult time, and we have to look at these statistics and take them seriously. But as I encourage all of my first and second year teachers who are out in the public schools in Indianapolis and surrounding areas, it's one child, one classroom, at a time, and we can make a huge difference when we structure that environment in a way that's enriching.
So is it true, really, that there are over 800,000 students every year who are identified as physically and emotionally abused? And you just
yes,
have these enormous numbers of children that you talk about being in foster care and
absolutely
having disabilities and
yes, and the Children's Defense Fund is provides this information and so Betsy, when we look at that, what we know in the brain, and this is fascinating and so important for us to know as teachers, is that when a child is experiencing and sitting inside a troubled environment, their ability to think through, to plan, to prioritize, to think logically, to take that deep breath and be reflective, it's impossible when stress is in place. So those higher level cognitive thinking skills literally shut down because the limbic system, which is our fight, flight, and freeze response, is activated. And actually for children that are sitting inside these pain-based behaviors and these troubled environments, it's almost a normal stress for them. And that's a concern for me because, we have to look at when they walk into our classrooms, what are they bringing with them? And we now know that poverty, almost 20% nationally of our children and adolescents are living in poverty.
Sarah, could you switch to the next slide, because we really have a way of sort of bringing this down to the classroom level. So I just thought we could.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And tell me where you are, because I'm still pulling out my slide too.
Okay, well, I thought we were going to look at the slide where because you talked about 20% living in poverty. You talk about also about 5 and 25. We have that little classroom who have mental health and emotional needs. 4 of the students are living in poverty. 1 would be struggling with severe abuse. And then in areas that have really concentrated poverty, the numbers go up. And so you see this classroom of individual students, so many of whom have one or another issue and are living inside that little sphere of stress, as you referred to it.
Yeah, and so when we look at what a general education classroom is, and this is what I want to emphasize today, before we look at some of the strategies, but children and adolescents that are coming into our classrooms that may not have an individualized and probably don't have an individualized education plan that supports their learning and their emotional and social challenges are coming in, and we are being called what I call to teach holistically to that whole child. To look at Abraham Maslow has an incredible, timeless, eternal hierarchy that I tell my teachers I think it needs to be posted in every classroom because it looks at the basic needs. Is that child coming in hungry? Are they coming in thirsty? Are they feeling safe? And those are the type of issues besides the academics that we have to address when we have children coming in from these troubled environments. And, so again, it's looking at that holistic landscape and looking at those vulnerabilities and those fragilities of so many diverse students.
So maybe I could ask you now to tell one of your stories. You tell so many wonderful stories about students that really bring this to life. I don't know whether you want to talk about Javier, who's right near the beginning of your book, and it just blew me away when I read that.
Yes, I'd love to talk about that. So part of my position at Marian is I work with first and second year teachers. And one of my students, graduate students, who was at the time a first-year teacher, was working in a middle high school. And one of the students had been suspended. And the reason that he had been suspended was because he was not in proper uniform. He had been wearing black shoes when, the protocol for uniform was white shoes. But, Betsy, the sadness of the story and the frustration is that Javier, at the time, was 16 years old in the 9th grade. He had been held back 3 or 4 times. He was Hispanic, Latino student, and living with a single parent, a mom who was trying to make ends meet. And when he was suspended for not having the correct shoes, he and his mother came into the school, talked with the administration, and asked if they could have an extension. She did not have any money. They had been evicted from their home the day before, and even the teacher had offered to buy the shoes. But the administrator of the building, was very authentic in saying, it's more than the shoes, and at this point, you're just not a good fit for our school. And the bottom line is, Betsy, is that what was happening is, and again, I've had to take a big look at this big perspective here, because the administrator was very concerned about the school's test scores, and Javier's test score would bring the other test scores down. And so, again, he probably, most likely, was feeling a lot of pressure, from administration also. But when we just peel back these layers and we look at, how we are coming to our children and how we really are looking at education, because really the purpose of education is to live outside the walls of school. And we need to be proficient in math and science, but I look at Javier and I look at the story and I think about what were the gifts, what were his passions, and what could we have created in a classroom, because at the time his teacher shared he was making incredible progress, and he was attending school, which before, earlier on, his attendance had just been horrific. So I shared this story in more detail in the book, but I think again, not pointing right, wrong, good, or bad, but I think we have to look again at our priorities and looking at how we're going about and looking at education in this time of reform.
Well, Javier also is, based on the many stories you tell, is really not alone in that. And he was basically kicked out of his school or counseled out of his school, however you want to do it, because he was going to have a negative effect on their test scores. And so I start to wonder, how could he possibly recover from this? How does he turn out? And one of the things that you say is a lot may depend on whether he remembers what that particular teacher, your student, did to help him, and
Absolutely.
use the term resilience. So I wanted you to talk about what really is resilience and how do we develop it?
Resilience is, I looked, as I was preparing for this webinar, I was really looking at all the definitions of resilience, and I think that it is, from my perspective and looking at these definitions, I think it's that ability to just keep persevering and to hold a perspective where we look at our mistakes or failures as learning opportunities and tools. And, Betsy, I'm thinking, too, that some children and adolescents have maybe a more innate ability to be resilient, where others it's more difficult, it's more challenging to to live from that place of mistakes and failures. And I was listening to, or actually I was reading an article by Ken Robinson just yesterday before class, and he was saying to me that he feels, and this is what we talk about in this book, is that we've got to find a way to encourage our children to take risks and fail as being an integral part of their success. And for me, that is resiliency. And I think we can create a resilient culture in our schools, absolutely, but we can also do it in our individual classrooms, even if the disposition or the culture of the school feels not in alignment with where we are. And I want to share that with teachers today, because it really goes back to being compassionately present and giving that child an opportunity and those tools to know that mistakes are one of the most important tools you can hold to grow, to expand, and to be to be competent in those areas that you're passionate about.
And along with the we all make mistakes, and hopefully we learn that those are a productive part of growing. But then there's also the situation like Javier, where the mistakes were really outside of him. I mean, it's being able to also bounce back from stuff that just seems patently unfair.
Yes, absolutely. And one of the things that his teacher and I discussed after this whole experience had occurred, but that she was sharing with me, is we talked about there is just an incredible power of envisioning and sharing that story with that student, what you're able to see and know, and that is what she did with Javier. She shared with him all those times that they were together, his strengths, what she saw he was capable of doing, his passion. She mirrored that for him. She shared that story. And I remember sitting when we were having lunch, and she said, "Lori, I really hope, and I'm going to envision this too, that he is able to remember that and to hold that." And Betsy, what is so incredible today is that the neuroscience supports that. Our brains respond. They respond like a sponge. Our dopamine levels are increased when someone is affirming, when someone is sharing, when someone is helping us to see the possibilities. And what we now know is that when we can share a moment of affirmation or envisioning, for instance, what she did with Javier, perspectives broaden. And that's really important too, because when perspectives broaden, that stress response settles down, and then that higher level thought process opens up. And so, again, going back to Javier and all of those students where it feels out of their control, these mistakes and failures, but I want to encourage teachers and parents today that we begin anew every minute, and by sharing those stories and being in dialogue about the possibilities is not just trite and fluffy. It literally has a concrete and tangible response in the brain.
Oh, that's pretty exciting to know. So now we're going to move on, and the next slide is where we talk about the 6 components. And now we're going to start to get into some of the specifics and strategies and tools that people can use. And we have 6 components listed here. I don't know if you have your slide up, but I
do. I've got it right here. Now. I'm good.
So what we're going to do is we're going to go through each of these and have you comment a little bit about them and how we can use these things to foster resilience in individual students and as the classroom as a whole. And what we're going to do first, before we talk about behavioral engagement, is we're going to actually do a little audience participation. We have 3 different polls, 3 different questions we want to use to try and get some information from our audience. And so the first question has to do with retention of new material. And I think everybody will see how this connects into exactly what you were just talking about in terms of the brain being able to open up and to think at higher levels. But retention of new material 24 hours later is 95%, which seems like an enormous number to me, given what we often see in our classrooms. And then the choices are A, presented both visually and auditorily. B, it is discussed in groups and as a whole class. Or C, students teach one another the new content. And D, it is acted out. So if we could ask everybody to choose what they think the right answer is, and then we'll show everybody the poll, and then we'll ask you to enlighten us as to what the correct answer is.
Well, I was enlightened when I was researching this, though.
Well, I've read a lot of stuff, and I know that all of those techniques are good ways of getting students to interact with the material, but I'm not sure that I know which is the best. So I'm going to be interested to hear what the research tells us.
Okay.
So do we have a...
Are we ready?
We have about 34 seconds left to give people... There's a couple people that haven't answered yet, so I'm going to give them all a chance, but we can close it if you want me to close it. But 20 more seconds.
Okay.
Wait out those 20
seconds. Okay, that's
I have my answer in my mind. I have my answer in my mind, but I'm not going to tell what it is yet.
Okay. Me too. I can't take it. Darn.
This is the week of finals here in Indiana, so this is perfect that we're having a little assessment during this webinar.
Okay. All right. So
I'm going to just do the general poll results.
Okay.
Do they show?
I'm not seeing anything yet.
I can't see, but you guys can tell me.
I don't see anything yet.
You don't?
Nope.
Okay.
Yep.
Well, I have it set to show, but I'll try it one more time.
Close the count. Now I see it. So the number one response was about 50% of the audience picked C, when students teach one another the new content.
Okay.
And I have to say that that's what I would have selected also.
Absolutely. That's it. And so I just get excited even talking about this, because when we teach what we need to learn, when we teach this, it's so powerful, because the brain, when we're teaching something that we're learning, the brain responds to novelty, and the brain responds to curiosity. And so, and I want to add that emotional engagement registers in the brain right next to academic cognition. So when a student is teaching what they need to learn, there is deepened learning, and it's for the long term. And it's hard for us as teachers, because sometimes we feel that it's an all or nothing. So if we teach what we need to learn, we're giving up power or control in our classrooms. But what I encourage my teachers to do is just to pick a small topic out of a standard, or to allow your students to create a test question, and then pick 5 to 10 students who can create their multiple choice test questions, trade them, share them, do it in small groups, meet with a partner, and then maybe once they get used to this, you can choose, as a teacher in that classroom, you can choose 5 or 6 of those questions and, create the test based on the questions that the teacher chooses. It doesn't have to be the unit assessment, but it's not
only
just
daily feedback and making sure everybody
daily feedback. Absolutely.
Yeah. So on the next slide, then we have some more ideas around this whole idea of how you get students emotionally engaged, and this is so. You talk about behavioral engagement. Sometimes it makes it sound almost like classroom management or something, but and some of these items seem like traditional, but I think you mean something a little different.
I do, and when I say behavioral engagement, it's not synonymous with management. And again, because we know that the brain is wired emotionally for cognition, they sit together, and the more emotional, the more personal we can create the content, the better it's going to be received and ingested. So when we think about behavioral engagement, one of the things I want to mention this afternoon in this webinar is the importance of constantly giving children feedback. And we've heard this as teachers, and if you're listening, saying, yes, 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 I know this. But I want to talk specifically about feedback that is informative and that notices, that doesn't really praise, that doesn't really say good job, but it's very specific, and it notices what went well, and then it only suggests what could be added to or maybe, created a little differently. But the feedback, even if it's on a Post-it note, even if it's with different colored pens written on paper, even if it's tweeted, even if it's, posted, in a variety of ways, because we know our children today are engaged with social media hours upon hours. So, that as much as you can use that feedback, through technology is huge. And also I want to add this behavioral engagement piece is really incorporating self-assessment and self-tracking into your classroom. When we self-assess, when we really track how we're doing, it is intimately connected to motivation. And it's interesting because students will be much harder on themselves, or they will be more thoughtful when they are asked to sit alongside you. And we'll talk about assessment in a minute, but the Latin word of assessment means to sit beside. So when we talk about self-assessment, I think this is a huge strategy to implement to engage our students, just to help them to really see, in the end, it's really about teaching them how to be out in the world and how to determine if their job, if they're doing a good job, or if it's mediocre or poor. So, and when we tap into allowing them to be assessors alongside their peers or alongside the teacher, we're really empowering them. We're giving them some autonomy and some choice in the classroom. And those are two things the brain craves. Very, very important.
Now, I'm intrigued by this idea of Who Wants to Be a Millionaire and using that somehow in a classroom when there's a behavioral challenge, or used to also say academic. But how does that? Can you tell us how that would work as a?
Yeah, this was such a popular game show, and one of the things I'm always looking at standards and trying to find ways to really make the material personal and come to life. So again, because we know that the brain loves choice, this, having choices in coming up with a solution or an answer or, research, whatever's called for that day, when you give the child, and you could format this in so many different ways in your classroom, either individually or in partners, but giving them an opportunity to, because when we're frustrated, we shut down. And so if they know that coming up with the answer gives them a couple of options to either call a friend, which would mean to ask another classmate or to partner with someone, or to use the class as a whole, to help them. So we vote. And this is a great way to review for a test. And also I want to say it's a great opportunity. This strategy is also good to use as kind of a warm-up. Maybe you're giving maybe 2 or 3 assessments, in 1 week, with all the testing that we're doing. So maybe you choose one of those and you allow them to implement this strategy. And again, the eliminate 2 would be, you provide 3 possible solutions, and then you can eliminate maybe one of those so that they can pick between the other 2. So there are all kinds of options, but it gives choice, and it just lowers that stress level that so many children feel, when they're being called to come up with that right answer or that right solution.
Okay, great. All right, so our next topic area, our next one of your components of building resilient classroom has to do with the relationships between teachers and students. And there's, of course, a lot of research on the importance of that relationship, personally meaningful relationships in terms of academic outcomes. But what are some techniques and practical suggestions you have for helping to build those relationships?
Well, one of the things that, we all know that, next to a parent, a teacher is possibly and most probably the most important adult. When I say teacher, could be coach in a child's life. So, and to build trust and authenticity, yes, we know that that's important, but it's the how. So one of the things I want to share today that's been so powerful for me on many levels is I think it's so powerful for teachers to share their stories. The brain, again, craves stories. We love to hear personal things about one another. When you share a story, you put the information into a context. And again, a great way for us to learn content, but also to build relationships. So when a teacher really is sharing authentically and saying, and really saying, I've experienced this, or tell me this is something that I've gone through. Tell me how this problem or how you're feeling is a little bit different. But sharing the story is huge. The second thing I want to go through on this slide is asking questions, Betsy, because what we know is the brain processes questions long after they've been asked. And one of the things that I have learned about, and still I'm just playing with and learning, is that when you ask a child or an adult or anyone what they need, how can I help you, their defense mechanisms just break down, and they literally shift perspectives so that they are more open and thinking. And also there's a compassionate presence, because when we ask anybody what they need, we're really inviting them in. And we're saying, I'm here for you. I'm ready to listen. And so when you ask the question, the second part is, are you listening to respond? Because that's a natural tendency for us, is to want to give the right answer, or are you listening to understand? And a good friend of mine, my mentor, I call him my mentor, Michael McKnight, has taught me about validation as being another strategy. And I heard him speak a couple weeks ago, and he shared that when you validate what a student is feeling, you are opening the door a bit wider for more dialogue and discussion. And also there's another piece there where there's trust. It's almost, you can see, if you started building the word trust, you see T, then you see R, then you see U, and as you validate any child, they will tell you if you're right or if you're wrong, if you're on the right track or the wrong track. So I think this is another strategy that's huge when we're looking at building those relationships. So asking the questions, validation, and sharing stories is really important. I also have down here 5-minute chat boards. I love this because sometimes we come in to a classroom, and teachers included, and we've got to get to the testing. We've got to cover the standards. Our time is just so limited. And I think if you create a place in your room or a box where you can have, and sometimes they may not be too personal, so you could, put, I need to speak to you today, or I have a situation I need to talk about, so they can put it up on a chat board, or if it's a question on homework, or if it's a question about a topic. So, and then if it's more private, you could create a worry box. Where children and adolescents can come and write out their concerns.
So I just want to make sure that I understand. So what you do is you have students come into the classroom, and for the first 5 minutes of the class, they would,
or 2 minutes, 2 to 3 minutes. Yeah, I think having these 5-minute chat boards or putting in this box where they can, just ask the questions, rid themselves of some of their worries. It's, we have do nows and we have bell ringers at the beginning of every class, and sometimes I think those are time killers. we use those as, and rightfully so, we use those so that we can get organized and get ready for the day. But I think this is a great way to invite dialogue, to invite questions, and it also builds community in a classroom. And one of the things that I want to share this real quickly because I know our time's going to run out. Research has shown, Betsy, and this is incredible, that before a test or before a tenuous situation, if a child or an adolescent or any of us, if we can write out, if we can get our thoughts and our feelings onto a piece of paper before we take that test, we literally create capacity in the working memory. And I love this because this is a great exercise and strategy to use before you give a test, or before group discussion, or before something that comes up in the classroom where everyone needs to be engaged and involved, and it may be a little monotonous. So I think that's really, really, those are really important strategies. They build relationship, but they also build classroom culture.
That is a good one. And so we're talking, part of what we're talking about is when we're talking about these teacher relationships is something you will refer to as compassion. And we have another little quiz here. I don't know if it's a quiz or it's a way to get us all thinking about these things and what we know or maybe we don't know about what compassion is. So again, excuse me, Sarah has opened up the poll, and
it only has 1:30 this time.
Oh.
Okay.
So choice A is an innate trait. Choice B is a trait or skill that can be taught. C is a trait or skill that cannot be taught. So obviously all of the above is not going to be an option here because we have direct opposites. And it's a trait that we either possess or don't possess. So think about what we think about compassion. And again, I think I have my answer.
And there, actually, I think there could be a couple of answers on this because it's still being researched, and
well, we also know that most characteristics that are reflected in our behavior are not all just genes or all just environment, and that there's sort of can be an interaction between the two. So I'm sort of talking around your answers here. Hopefully without giving it all away, but that's how I would approach it, to say that
I agree.
And we know we have we all have mirror neurons and things that would tend to help us reflect and understand what others are experiencing, which would be part of compassion. Okay, so the time is...
I don't have a question in front of me, so tell me, Betsy, I don't have that in this PowerPoint. Tell me what or I can go ahead and share.
Compassion is an innate trait, a trait or skill that can be taught, a trait or skill that cannot be taught, and a trait that we either possess or don't possess.
And I'm going to share with you, as I created this question, I think it can be A or B. So I don't know. I don't know how our audience. And let me. What is? Was I close? Were you? Is that what you were going to?
I was going to say B. And
me too.
And so what did the audience say?
Well, I've applied it, but maybe you're not seeing it yet. 75% say B, a trait or skill that can be taught.
Mm-hmm. And so this is so exciting. Dr. Rick Hansen, I've been reading his book on compassion, and he is doing a lot of research and has shared some research also with looking at this compassion piece and the areas in the brain that are affected. And what's interesting is that in our neurobiology, and I'm going to go with it's B, but the reason I say the answer could be A is that in our neurobiology, we are wired to be relational people, and we have that wiring to be compassionate. But in the hunter-gatherer, and as we know, we were survivors, and we were we had that us and them and you and me, and our main purpose living in that hunter-gatherer as we look through our evolution was to be in that fear-flight response. And so today we have to be very cognizant and awake to that that biologically wired response of feeling that that us against them, we, you against I, and so we see this a lot of times. And I think if we're all really honest and authentic, we can be very judgmental, kind of in a subconscious way, and we look at differences in one another rather than focusing on commonalities. And I want us to be gentle with ourselves, and this is something that, as educators, we can really enrich and teach this in the classroom because we need each other. We're wired for one another, and the prefrontal cortex and also our insula, which is in that inner part of the brain, are fired and working together when we feel compassion and when we feel empathy. And Betsy, I think the most important thing that we can teach one another and our students is to be empathic. It's there. We have the wiring for it, but if it's not modeled in our homes, and if it's not modeled around us, and the people in our immediate environment are always shouting or yelling or reacting instead of responding, it's very difficult. We are creatures of habit, and our neural circuitry literally aligns itself with our thoughts and feelings.
So that really brings us into the next component area where you talk about being peer relationships. And I think of bullying as being the very antithesis of what you've just been talking about. But a lot of that happens because of what's being modeled and the lack of being taught, the lack of being developed in terms of those compassion factors.
Yes.
So how do we, especially in these adolescent years? So help us through that one.
Okay, so this bullying is huge. And what we now know that directly and intimately is connected to bullying is that in our brains we hold a negative bias for anything that it feels or that we think is negative. Our brains, it's almost like how it's been described to me as our minds are like Velcro for any negative emotion and Teflon for anything that's positive. And there are many, many positive things happening around us, to us, through us, but those just slide right on through because of our wiring. We kind of attach ourselves to this negative, mindset. So when we look at bullying, there's a real fear of differences. And at the crux of bullying, and you look at peers, and you look at the ages, and I'm going to say between 11 and 17, the teenage motto is, you can say and do anything to me, but whatever you do, don't call me out. Don't embarrass me. And so when we look at that truly significant, unspoken, secret, mantra, or motto of adolescence, bullying is happening on so many levels. I mean, there's cyberbullying, and there's, our social media has expanded it, but it's really looking at how different we are, and that feels very fearful. Doesn't look fearful, but it feels very fearful to students versus what are our commonalities. And I think in the middle school years, when we have a prefrontal cortex that is completely underdeveloped, which is the seat of our, rational, logical reasoning, and we have this on-fire, ignited limbic system that's our fight-flight response. We have hormones surging through the body, and we have peers becoming much more important than family members at that time. And sexual exploration, it's just a hot pot, or as we say at our house, it's just a hot mess. And so when we look at bullying, I think that what we can do as educators and parents in our classrooms is to really just build culture, emphasize commonalities rather than differences. And in fact, I had my teachers this year have their students bring in baby pictures of every single student in the classroom, and birth to age 1 or 2, and they posted those, and they wrote about each student wrote about their feelings, some of the experiences that they had in their younger years, the baggage that that was with them in their developing years. And they had a bulletin board in the classroom where they showed these pictures, and it helped the students to remember, where we all came from, and that innocence and that vulnerability, and maybe what has angered and hurt and troubled us in these growing years. So it's a strategy that I think is very important when you really look at the crux of bullying. And
are they surprised then to see how many other of their classmates had the same issues?
It was a huge positive response, and we're going to continue to do this. And you know what, Betsy? Here's the other thing, is that many adolescents, because they don't want to be called out, they don't want any attention drawn to themselves, the response. So when you look at bullying, there's a group of bystanders. So when you look at the bystanders, they are feeling, in their mind, they're thinking, this doesn't feel right. It doesn't feel good to them to be a bystander, but they feel that everyone is being a bystander. And what a couple of police officers who work here in Indianapolis at the Peace Learning Center did some research and a poll, and in this poll, it showed that the students were all feeling similar responses. They didn't like the feelings that were associated with being a bystander, but they felt that everybody was feeling the same way. And so one of the things we can do as teachers is to have that dialogue in our classrooms and to share that research, to share, this is what we're finding, is that each of you, even though you don't like how it feels, you all think that everybody's thinking that this is cool, or that this is our only, option. This is how we opt out of this. So this is so important to really share, not only, what everyone's feeling, and to take these assessments in your classroom, to talk about what you're feeling and the thoughts you have, but also to talk about the effects on the brain too, because when children know what's happening in their own brains, it gives them power and control.
Okay, well, that takes us then into another area where you had talked before about teachers being or coaches being the most important adults in children's lives, apart from their parents. But we also need to take into account what's happening in the home, and the parents' relationships, and how can that play in, and what do you recommend in terms of some strategies there? Homeschool relationships are just key, as we all know. So one of the things that I want to share this afternoon is that I feel many parents had very negative or some very fearful school responses, in their growing years. And so if there feels to be a lack of interest or maybe some apathy as far as, building that triangle of home, school, and child, I encourage educators this afternoon to really look at, possibly another perspective in what's happening. So, in the past of that parent. One of the things that I think is just so important, and no matter what you teach, is to really pair families together. Now, this is something we're going to be trying this coming fall, and we've talked about it in the spring, and a couple of my graduate students have done this. We've talked about homework and how, it's just so, it's frustrating. So what we're going to be doing is to build this family relationship. We are going to be asking for maybe 2 or 3 students and their families to pair together and to communicate. And so what one of my teachers is going to be doing is she is going to be holding a monthly parent meeting with, some snacks and, some snacks and food and some drinks. And they're going to talk about what's the best way that we can all not only increase achievement in our classroom, but what can we do to build community in our classroom. And so one of the things they're going to be doing is they're going to pair families, and what that does is it holds one another accountable so that they're communicating through email, they're communicating through Facebook, they're communicating, through Twitter,
or whatever vehicle, but they're going to be holding each other accountable, for some of the extracurricular activities and homework. And I think that's, I just think that's huge. I have down here videotape for families, and I want to share this if the families give you permission. I think it's really a positive phone call home, as we know, is huge. But now with iPhones and with our technology, I think it would be so incredibly powerful to videotape one of your students having a fabulous moment and send that to the parents. And this, I could do a whole other webinar on picking out this, but when you can hone in and really tap in to just 1 minute, I don't care if you may have to dig, but a phone call is fabulous, but sending a video or, however, and maybe that family doesn't have the technology to receive that, but being creative here and, really thinking about how you can affirm and share what's going well and right in your classroom is just huge.
I, as a parent of 3 boys, I can certainly testify to the need for a positive phone call every once in a while.
Yeah.
Okay, we've got a couple more areas. This second to last component has to do with academic self-determination. And so we're going to do another quick poll here, and maybe we can sort of talk about this all in one. So what happens in a classroom when students' need for autonomy is ignored or not addressed? Do students feel angry? Do they feel anxious? Do they feel bored? Or is the answer D, all of the above? So what are some things that you can do? We can sort of back this up a little bit, and we'll come back to the poll. But what are some things that you can do to actually increase students' self-determination?
Okay, so when we talk about self-determination, it's goal setting. And one of the things that is just key is student choice. Again, this goes back to self-assessment. I think that when you look at emotional challenges, oppositional behaviors, you look at specific learning disabilities, when we look at all of these areas, it boils down, Betsy, and this is what we're talking about this year, are to the executive functions, those higher thought processes, higher cognitive abilities. And we literally this year we looked at how we can take, for instance, instead of saying my student is hyper, or my student is impulsive, or my student constantly is challenging everyone and me in the classroom, so the power struggle is an issue. We can look at these executive functions, and we can look at their ability to plan. We can look at their ability to prioritize. We can look to see how flexible they are. These are higher level thought processes that affect. It's across the continuum. We can look to see, do they have emotional regulation? Do they have response inhibition? Do they have sustained attention? So when we look at goal setting, it's really important to sit down and to really work with these students on these specific sub-skills rather than being so general. We get stuck as educators and we say, okay, they're inattentive, they're out of their seat, but what can I do? So I think one of the most important things, where we begin is looking at these sub-skills and having that dialogue with the student. I'm noticing that every time, John, I give an assignment, it's taking you 10 minutes to get started, and I'm really concerned because that is 8 minutes, where everyone else is working. So I want to help you, and I want us to work through this. So what can we do? Tell me what's going on, in your head, what's happening when, I give out this assignment. How are you feeling? And so those are some of the specific things where students can begin to not only look really deeply at what's happening, but then they can make small incremental goals. They can say, okay, I need to pay attention, or I need to start my assignment within 4 minutes. So, you're finding success, and you can use a little timer. You can use your body to walk over to the desk after 2 minutes. But, again, the whole point is that you and your student are dialoguing, and you've developed a system where you are holding each other accountable for these specific skills. And and as Betsy, as we talked, I've got some handouts for our audience on these specific, social and emotional assessments that I can share, and also these executive skill questionnaires for parents and teachers that are absolutely awesome from Dawson and Gare, their research from Guilford Press. They're just really excellent.
I know that our audience will appreciate that. And they seem to be in very strong agreement that all of the above was the correct answer.
Yeah, that's it. Yes, absolutely.
So we get lots of when students don't have this ability or don't feel that they have the ability to direct some of what's happening to them in the classroom, then they can feel all kinds of emotions that aren't very positive.
Yes, it's just and they spill into one another.
But then I think that your point was not just you're not just telling them, well, you've got to start right away. You wasted 8 minutes. You've got to start right away, because that doesn't necessarily tell them what they need to focus on or how they need to change their behavior. But focusing on what it is that's in their way and then helping them problem solve around that seems like it would be much more effective.
Exactly. And I want to add to that this is, we don't hesitate as teachers to reteach a math problem or to reteach a concept, an academic concept. But we hesitate or we feel uncomfortable when we have to reteach a specific social or emotional skill, some of those executive functions that I mentioned. And I think that what we are discovering as we work with our inner city public and charter schools here, my teachers, and I'm learning every day, is that when we really begin to look at and talk to that student, they take this little assessment. What's keeping you, or what is it that what's keeping you from starting that assignment, or let's look at how this homework isn't coming back. And then when we can dissect it together and then begin to find a way to reteach the skill and model it and practice, because obviously, practice, makes permanent. So it's these social and emotional skills. And again, I don't feel like it's extra work. I feel like it's, in the long run, it's going to be so incredibly powerful as far as closing those achievement gaps and raising those test scores, because this is the base, the foundation of it. Very important.
So you've, which really brings us to assessment. You just have been talking about assessments and helping students be able to self-assess, but you have some other assessment strategies. And I know we're bumping up against our planned conclusion time, but what I'd like to do is at least finish this up, and then Lori, if you are willing to stay on and maybe take a few questions,
sure.
We'll run over a little bit. Those who can't continue with us, we're very glad that you were able to be present, and we, again, will be sending out the slides as well as the materials that Lori's been talking about, and there's always the opportunity to view this again. So, but those of you who can stay for a few more minutes, we will continue on a little bit past our planned stopping time. So for this is now not necessarily individual assessments, but tell us what you're thinking about here.
Okay. So when I'm looking at this slide with assessment strategies, I think that, again, when we look at what assessment truly is, we need to look at this formative assessment and look at this holistic, or what is also termed brain-compatible assessments. So I'm just going to list some of these since we're very short on time. But observations, I encourage teachers to have a notebook and carry it with them all the time, just like you would, one of those little backpacks or fanny packs. Just observing how your students respond to a particular experience. How are they interacting with peers? If you have a new seating arrangement, what are their conversations like? It's just so important. One of the things that I love this assessment, and I've done this in my graduate and my undergraduate classes, and I know they've done it with their students, is I think assessing in groups, small groups, is so important. And one of the things that I have done is I give each group that has 4 people in each group 2 big ice cubes, a baggie, and a paper cup. And so 3 of those people have to collaborate and melt the ice in 2 minutes. And there are no other instructions. The 4th person in that group has to observe and record what's happening. And this is fascinating because as the instructor or educator in your classroom, to walk those groups and to see how they're working together or to see how they're creatively or critically thinking through this, it's just multifaceted assessment. What's also interesting is to see how your recorder recorded the experiences, what they actually noticed. So it's a great opportunity to look at assessment from so many different angles. I think it's very important to look at assessment as far as process and not product-oriented. And so what I mean by that is, again, looking at how your students use choice in your classroom. And so I have on the slide choice and voice, how they are able to appropriately, ask for what they need, again, something that can be modeled. And so we look, they're being assessed in acuity, they're being assessed with ECAs, they're being assessed with here, NWEA, and, so many different ways. But we have to have complement assessments and brain-compatible assessments so that we're getting the whole picture, Betsy, and we're also, in that assessment, allowing them to create and to, be problem solvers and also to sit with the problem, which is, a huge autonomy booster. It's an injection of empowerment in the classroom, too.
Well, it's also what Common Core professes to be all about, the Common Core
yes,
standards.
Yes,
so which is where all this ultimately sort of comes together.
It does.
Okay,
and I like that part.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have sort of gotten to the end here, and as I said, we will be sending out. Sarah, has anybody been typing any questions as we've been going along?
Only one at the beginning when we were talking about resilience, wanting to know how we teach it, but we just explained all of that.
Yeah.
That's the only one we have
talked
so far.
about lots of strategies to do. I have a question that came up when someone was registering, and they said, "What do you do?" You've talked about asking questions and what happens to our brains when someone says, "How may I serve you? How can I help you? What do you need?" But I'm sure we all have probably some experience that similar to what this person had, where she said, "What happens if a child can't come up with anyone, or the child says, 'Oh, no one can help me. It's my problem.'" What suggestions would you have in that situation?
Okay, so I was just reading this afternoon. I wish I had, Betsy. When you asked me that, I wish I had just this incredible response that a child would never have to experience that aloneness or that isolatedness. But and when that child responds in that way, that it's very true for them. So I think we have to acknowledge the pain or the frustration or the anguish, because they may not feel that they have anyone, and they may not have anyone that can truly, be there for them that can ask, "What can I do for you?" But I think one of the things that is key, and again, these are kind of 3 strategies in one to wrap up this webinar to answer that question, is that I think it's very important to sit beside that student and to help them to list those resources they do have. And you might have to sit there and brainstorm with that child and really, really think about some of the resources, the people, the experiences. Maybe it's just in school. Maybe but help them to know that they are protected, that they have some resources that they can go to that, we just haven't thought about or just haven't, we just haven't put out there. So I think really helping them to brainstorm and looking at the resources that they do have, because we all have something or someone. And if we can't think of it, then we need, as an educator, a parent, we need to really help them and develop that one person. I love that saying, every child needs somebody that's, absolutely, irrationally crazy about them. And so we need to help them to find that. And the other part of this, too, is that, when we look at a compassionate presence in the classroom, it's really helping that child to not only envision what they can't see yet, but it's helping them to take a deep breath. And the power of the breath, we know that a long, long exhale initiates our parasympathetic nervous system. So it's helping them to take a long breath, giving them just a little bit of space, and then listing, brainstorming all of the positives that are happening, even if you have to create some on the spot, just helping them to see the opportunities or what could be, that is tangible for them. Those are just key.
We have a colleague, actually Peter Klein, who has written a number of books, who talks about one of the exercises he used to do with kids in his classroom, where he would have them come in every day and say a positive thing that had happened to them.
I love that.
And he said, sometimes at the beginning they really couldn't, I can't think of anything. Well, if you make them, okay, my cat didn't die. So
exactly.
comes up with things which are just the opposite of negatives. But eventually, they were able to do it, and then they started to focus on. So it's sort of a tandem with your, write down your worries, get those back onto paper, and then focus on something positive, and then it's that learning process is much more.
And it shifts. That perspective shifts, and we see again the wiring in the brain and those neural pathways are just we can 15 minutes a day, 20 minutes a day, 40 minutes a day, whatever you have with that child, whatever you have, it makes a difference. It counts, and that is really I think that's just such exciting news in this time of great educational upheaval and changes and shifts.
Well, we certainly had reinforced today some of the things that probably a number of people knew were the right things to do, but really understanding why they're so powerful and so brain compatible is also, I think, very helpful. It gives us a lot more confidence when we're doing some of these things, and points out again how closely related all of these, emotional developmental issues are to the academics, and that we have to attend to those as well.
Yes. And, Dan Goleman in his book years ago, it stressed and researched that, that the high intelligence does not predict IQ. And when we lack in compassion and empathy, that has more to do. That compassion and empathy has more to do with your success in the world than IQ. And so, again, we know this, but I want to share with teachers and school leaders and parents today that the great news is that even through the book that came out, How Children Succeed, by Paul Tough, these non-cognitive, these social and emotional skills can be taught, and they can be modeled and reinforced, and they can become a part of a child's everyday in all of our lives. And I want to add too that I want to say to teachers, lately I've seen teachers looking about as hopeless and feeling depleted as are some of their students. And compassion in a classroom begins with self-compassion. So, and we're not really good receivers here in the West sometimes. And self-compassion is really the crux of breeding that compassion in a classroom. So, when you can really take care of yourself and fill yourself up and be reflective and be honest with yourself and share your challenges as an educator and be reflective, research shows that the difference between a good teacher and a superior teacher are those that self-reflect and that really and as metaphorically touch their cheeks, as Dr. Rick Hansen says. You touch your cheek to show that there's that compassion because it activates those neural circuits in the brain.
Well, that is a great note to end on. Lori, we want to thank you so much for being part of our webinar today. And I could keep on talking for hours, but we're not going to put everybody through that. So.
Thank you so much.
Anyway, thank you. Thank you, everybody, for attending, and we'll look forward to talking to you all again soon. Thanks.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
All right. Thanks, Betsy.
Yep.
Bye-bye.